and we welcome Megan Evans, who is the Executive Director of Alberta Invasive Species Council. And she's going to share with Alberta Communities in Bloom how to recognize and deal with invasive plant species in their communities. And she'll also share tips on how Communities in Bloom committees can take a leadership role in educating residents and working with their municipality to identify and limit the spread of invasive plant species. So welcome, Megan. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Wonderful, thanks for having me.
The first question is, can you tell us what an invasive plant actually is?
Sure. So an invasive plant is a species that originated somewhere else and it's moved to a new location, and it causes harm in this new location that it's found itself in. And that's because the things that would normally have kept its populations in check where it evolved didn't come with it. And those things include things like environmental conditions, pests, predators, those sorts of things. So not all non-native species become invasive. We have tons of non-native species in Alberta, and only a small fraction of those do become invasive and problematic. And in Alberta, we actually take our invasive plant species very seriously. We have a piece of legislation called the Weed Control Act that lists a number of provincially legislated invasive species. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but yeah, there's 75 species on there. Some of them are likely ones that we're familiar with, and some might be ones that we know a little less about. But yeah, so we do have lots of information about those species on our website, and there's all sorts of different opportunities for information about those species.
Okay, so perhaps along this line, could you tell us the difference between invasive, noxious, problem?
Absolutely.
The official definitions, kind of.
Yeah, there's a lot of terminology. There's a lot of words that we hear associated when we talk about weeds and invasive plants. And so provincially, under the Alberta Weed Act, we have two different categories of weeds. So we have prohibited noxious and we have noxious. So there's only two categories recognized under provincial legislation. There's 46 species listed that are prohibited noxious. And those are the species that if you have a prohibited noxious species on your property, you as the landowner are responsible to eradicate it. You have to destroy every part of that plant and completely get rid of it. So those prohibited species are ones that are not yet widespread within Alberta. So those include things like giant hogweed, which is a big scary plant, Japanese knotweed, which is a plant that actually can threaten house foundations. Like, it's so incredibly strong, it can break through concrete. So those are a couple of examples of species that aren't yet present in the province. They're not widespread, and landowners are responsible to eradicate those species. Those are the prohibited noxious. The noxious species, there are 29 noxious species listed in the province, and those are ones that are far more widespread. So that includes things like Canada thistle, oxeye daisy, creeping bellflower. Those are ones that you find pretty much all throughout the province. So as a landowner, you are responsible to control those species. So you don't have to even eradicate it, but you have to control it and prevent it from spreading further. And the difference really in the two classifications has to do with the prevalence and how widespread they are within the province, if that makes sense. If you pop onto the Alberta Invasive Species Council website, which is abinvasives.ca, we have a number of fact sheets. We have a fact sheet developed for every single one of those listed species, all of the noxious and prohibited noxious. So there's tons of information online to help guide you in identifying those.
Okay, then why are invasive plants actually not beneficial? Why are we so afraid of them? And why do we have to control them?
Right, yeah, no, such a good question. So it really depends. It depends a little bit on context. And when we talk about, we have all kinds of different invasive species. So we have aquatic invasive species, and we have like terrestrial invasive insects. We have things like wild pigs, and they all cause different types of problems in these different environments. With regard to invasive plant species, they pose both economic and ecological impacts. And so ecologically, invasive plant species take over areas. So if you think about a beautiful mountain meadow or a native rangeland or piece of native grassland, those ecosystems would be full of tons of different plants. You would have mosses and lichens and forbs and shrubs and grass species. And those species would provide a number of ecosystem services. So they would provide food and habitat for wildlife. Their root structure tends to be quite substantial, and they help to hold the soil in place, which is really important in riparian areas. They also tend to kind of cover the soil in a nice way that it prevents erosion. So then you don't have erosion of topsoil and you don't have sedimentation into water bodies. So those are just some of the examples of what these native plants do for us in those native plant communities that we're trying to protect. So when an invasive plant comes in, you'll wind up, what can happen is if you have a particularly aggressive invader, one species can wipe out an entire area. You can go from having tons and tons and tons of different species to having just one or two. And they're not necessarily going to, those invasive species won't necessarily provide food or wildlife or habitat. They don't necessarily have those long root systems that are important for holding the soil in place. And some of them are even allelopathic, wherein they secrete a chemical into the soil and that prohibits any other plants from growing in the local vicinity. So that creates patches of bare soil, which again is problematic for erosion and sedimentation into water bodies. So that's how they're problematic in our natural ecosystems. They're problematic in agricultural ecosystems. Of course, we know that terrestrial invasive weeds pose problems, can reduce crop yields, and can become problematic for growers as well. In our urban areas, it's a little bit different. So we of course have natural areas within urban areas that we want to protect that have lots of native plants and native plant communities. But when we're talking about our individual yards, often our lawns are actually, lawn grass is a terribly invasive species. It can spread quite substantially, and in a natural system, lawn grass would be very problematic. It's very aggressive. Lawn grass species are not listed provincially, so you are of course allowed to plant them, and that's okay. And we tend to do a pretty good job in cities of keeping our lawns where we want them to be. But I think we have some species that are more problematic in urban areas. And I'm sure you're all familiar with creeping bellflower, which can be an incredibly problematic invasive plant species. It was originally planted as an ornamental. That's how a lot of these invasive plant species got here. They were brought in. We didn't recognize the issues at the time, and people planted them in their yards. And now they have a heck of a time trying to get rid of them. So for gardeners, it's really about what you want in your yard and preventing the spreading of any weeds to nearby areas, for example, to your neighbor and that sort of thing. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it's really context specific. There are provincial legislation, there's provincial rules with regard to the species that are listed, but when it comes down to invasive species and the threats that they pose, it really depends on the context and what we're trying to protect, really.
That's really interesting because that affects environment, affects agricultural economics, and the urban setting. Absolutely. Now in Alberta, for example, there's different zones where different plants are more problematic than others. Yeah. I hear from a lot of people in my part, I'm from central Alberta, and they're really upset that Gypsophila is gone because they like that for wedding bouquets, because it's not a particular invasive problem here. But you see in southern Alberta huge differences. So are there quite a few plants, invasive plants, that are more problematic in one part of the province and not in another?
Yes, definitely. That's a really good point. So some of them are just super aggressive and can do well pretty much anywhere. But some of them are definitely a little bit more ecoregion specific, right? Like we've got some more grasslandy type weeds, we have forested weeds, those sorts of things. With regard to your baby's breath, though, it's interesting because it's only, I can't remember if it's the perennial or the annual, so you can still get baby's breath, but you have to make sure that you're getting the one that's non-invasive. And I think
the paniculata is the one that's invasive, yeah.
Exactly. So you can, so I think it's the annual that you can still have access to, but it's, again, baby's breath is really problematic in southern Alberta. Yeah, so, but regardless, some of those ones are listed provincially, so it's across the board.
Do you get quite a bit of feedback from different parts of the province that people are concerned that the plant in their backyard is considered invasive and they're having a hard time getting it to grow?
Yeah, we do.
Russian olive is another one that is interesting because it's very difficult to grow in this area, and people work really hard at it. But it's on the hit list.
Yeah, so Russian olive is actually not listed provincially. So that's
Well, it's
not,
not okay.
it's not. There are some similar species that are, but it is a controversial species because of
Okay.
what you're suggesting. So in some areas, like in the Medicine Hat area, for example, it is incredibly invasive and it is invading river valleys and displacing native vegetation, and it's really problematic. But in other areas, like you've suggested, it's hard to grow, right? So it's that one is definitely very specific, and it's found where it likes to be in Alberta for sure.
I think that's so important to spread information so people understand why it can be a problem and where it is a problem in the province, so that they're not contributing to the problem in any way.
Exactly.
Yeah, we mentioned the names of a couple plants. So what do you hear about as being the most invasive ones? What are the top most problematic ones?
So again, I think it's really context specific too. It depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about, urban areas, it's quite a bit different than if we're talking about in the native grasslands and those sorts of things. In urban areas, I would say, again, creeping bellflower has got to be, there's an entire Facebook page in Alberta devoted entirely to creeping bellflower and people's eradication efforts of that plant species. I live in the Crow's Nest Pass, which is a bit notorious for having a diversity of invasive species. And we battle things like oxeye daisy in our yards. Common tansy is really problematic for us down here. Blueweed, which is a beautiful flower, but a terrible, terrible invasive plant species. So it's really context specific, and it might also vary to depending on which ecoregion these various urban areas are in. I think with regard to some of the species that are coming in from BC, we've got pressure with species coming in from BC and some coming up from Montana. The BC weeds, the prevailing winds are coming that way. So we're fighting that form of spread specifically. But we have a lot of invasive hawkweed species that are really problematic along the eastern slopes in the mountain parks. We have things like sulfur cinquefoil and spotted knapweed. Spotted knapweed is coming in from southern BC and also coming up from Montana. And that's incredibly scary and problematic for our native rangelands and our grasslands. Those species can be very damaging in those areas. So it really depends on the context and what areas we're talking about. But there's a lot of really problematic species that are already here, and there's a lot that are on our doorstep as well.
So what approach should communities take in identifying and starting to eradicate some of these?
Yeah, so there's a couple really easy things that people can do that can make a big difference. So one, you just said it, is learning to identify them. So I know I've said that there's 75 listed invasive plant species, and that might sound a little bit daunting, but we've got a lot of really good resources to help with identification. So one of them is these little Alberta invasive plant, I don't know if you can see it there, these invasive plant identification guides. These are really handy. These list all of the provincially legislated invasive plant species. We're working on a revision of these. We don't have any more of these. You might be able to get your hands on them from some other organizations. You can download the PDF, but there's really great information in here. The other really great tool I would recommend utilizing is we have an app, and it's called EDMAPS Alberta. So it's EDD Maps, and it stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping Systems, which is a mouthful, but it's a really great resource. So this, it's an app that you can download on your smartphone. It's also a website, so you can just access it on your computer if you'd like to. So if you go to EDMAPS Alberta, it'll bring up the web page. So if you have the app downloaded on your phone, it's free to download. You can go through it. You can go search by category. So say you're an angler and you've been fishing and you see something strange. Well, you can pull up all the aquatic invasive fish species if you were so interested. For us who are interested in plants, you would go to the terrestrial invasive plant category, and then you can go through and you can search the images. Each image in each species has a profile attached to it. So it'll talk about how you identify it, where it will grow, how can you control it, has all of that information. And there's also a built-in identification guide, and I'm just trying to find it right here. It's in front of me. Here we go. I'm going to pull, I know this is silly, I'm going to put this up to the screen. So there's this built-in invasive plant identification guide. So this shows like a cartoon sketch of a flower. So what you would do, if you tap on the petals, I just tapped on the petal, you can't see that, but you would type in the petal color and the number of petals, and then it would refine it to the 5 or so species of blue plant or of blue flowers or that sort of thing. So it's a really great identification guide to help you identify what you're dealing with on the ground. In addition to that, if you're out and about, if you say you're in a city park, or if you're in a natural area or provincial park or public lands, you can report invasive species using this app as well. So if you come across something that's particularly bad, or even one of the more common species, it's really important that we can create this database. And also any reports that come into us of invasive species, we send off to the local authorities. So we first verify the identification, and then we send it to the local authorities. So if you're finding stuff in the city of Edmonton and you load it up, we get those reports, and then we'll send them all off to the contact that we have with the city of Edmonton. So this app allows us to do a number of things. One, it helps folks with identification and information about our invasive species. Two, it allows them to report locations of invasive species, which allows us to create a distribution database, which we are currently working on. It's a bit of a work in progress, but we have that database online right now. And those reports get sent to the local authorities so that they can take action. So you might not want to be reporting yourself if you're in your yard and you find some oxeye daisy. You might not want to report yourself, but you can do that in all sorts of other areas. And that really can help land managers with their control of invasive plant species as well. So this is a really great app. So that has to do with the identification. So that's one really important thing that people can do, is learn to identify the plant species. Another one is the prevention activities. So we've got a number of different campaigns that focus on prevention activities. One of them is called our Be Plant Wise, Grow Me Instead program. So right now we have a brochure, working on a bit of a revision, and we hope to do more programming related to that. But it lists kind of some of the common offenders that you might find either growing in your yard, or that you may still be able to find in greenhouses, and it lists alternatives. So some of these invasive species, like we mentioned, are ornamental species that were brought over because they're beautiful and they grow really well. Well, what we've done is we've provided some alternatives. So say you want this really, yellow clematis is a great example. It's beautiful, it grows very easily, it requires almost no maintenance, but it's really invasive. So we provided a number of alternatives that you could grow that might provide the same type of aesthetic as that yellow clematis would. And those, the alternatives are non-invasive.
And all this information is on the website of the Alberta Invasive Species Council?
It is, yeah. We've got tons of resources on there. So yeah, absolutely.
And there's a link then to this app, this EDD Maps app?
Yeah, absolutely. If you go to abinvasives.ca, have a look around. There's all sorts of great stuff on there. You can get the EdMaps Alberta link. You can get the Grow Me Instead brochure. There's a link to all of those fact sheets for all of the species is on there. And yeah, there's a lot of really good information.
And do the municipalities get all this information? I'm thinking that if a community or people have identified a certain plant, should they also contact their county office, village office, whatever, to let them know in case they aren't aware of the threat?
Yeah, I would say either or. If you contact us, we'll get in touch with them, or you can go ahead and directly contact them. So especially in the more, all of the counties have a municipal agricultural fieldman, and those are the folks that are responsible for implementing the Weed Control Act. So we work really quite closely with the ag fieldmen across the province to help them with resources. They're the expert when it comes to controlling these species as well. Often we go to them when we need specific information about specific control efforts and those sorts of things. But yeah, we definitely try to work quite closely with them. But we try to be a really good resource and provide lots of different information about invasive species for Albertans. But your ag fieldmen are another great resource that is available to everybody as well.
Are you concerned with the control or having some control over the chemical herbicide application to control some of these? Is that being monitored so
Well,
that it's only safe controls?
yeah, so the herbicides on the market are well regulated, and they go through quite a rigorous testing process before they ever even get approved. And they have very specific label instructions. So the chemical is safe and it must be used in this way as laid out in the instructions. So there are like kind of over-the-counter type chemicals that we can go purchase to use in our yard. But for any large-scale application of herbicide in Alberta, an individual would require to be a certified pesticide applicator. So they need to go through quite a bit of training. They need to write an exam. It's heavily regulated. They need to, maintain a certain amount of professional development credits every year so they don't lose their certification. So these things, they get a really bad rap and they can be problematic. And I would say they're problematic when they're not used properly, right? That's when that's when the issues really start. So the chemicals themselves go through a rigorous testing process. The applicators who are using them, on a larger scale, go through a rigorous testing process and a certification process as well. And it's all about using the right chemical at the right time by a certified applicator. With regard to control options, I do want to point out that we do encourage integrated pest management, which is using all of the tools in the toolbox. So, and when we talk about integrated pest management, I think the number one most important thing is to talk about is prevention, because if we can prevent these things in the first place, we'll save ourselves a huge headache, and that's the single most best way of dealing with them. But when it comes to controlling invasive species, so in some cases, a herbicide is the best tool. And in other cases, hand pulling is the best tool. It's really about understanding the plant's biology, understanding the stage in that plant's life. So is it an annual? Is it a biennial? Are we dealing with a creeping rooted perennial? It really, really depends on a number of factors as to what tool you're going to use.
Really glad you went through that, because I think that for people to understand integrated pest management is so very important, and I just don't feel that there's a bunch of renegades out there just spraying everything in sight. So I'm glad to see that is becoming pretty mainstream. That's excellent. Are there some plants that are more serious than others, that are threatening the economy more than others, threatening health, threatening environment more than others?
Yeah, there's some big ones. Yeah, again, it really depends on what we're talking about. So maybe I'll go through out a couple of examples. So I mentioned giant hogweed earlier, and that might be one we're all this time of year. I know it's always in the news. So we don't have any giant hogweed in Alberta. To my knowledge, we've never had an actual confirmed report. But it is a scary, scary plant, and it's in BC, and I think it's like somewhere in central Canada as well, maybe Ontario.
Right in Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the one. It grows crazy tall, like 15 feet tall. It looks like cow parsnip, but it's not cow parsnip. And it's the one that if you get any of the sap from the plant on your skin, it can cause very serious burns that can stay with you for many, many years. So it's a very, definitely poses a risk to public safety. The Japanese knotweed is another terrifying one. I mentioned that as well. And that is the one that in the UK, home inspectors are trained to look for that species, because many insurance companies will not insure a home that has Japanese knotweed on the premises, because it can compromise the foundation of your home. That is also in BC. So BC has got a lot of these really scary ones that we don't want them here. But with regard to invasive plants, again, some of these other ones like spotted knapweed, sulfur cinquefoil, which can completely destroy our grasslands systems and our native rangelands. Grasslands are I think they're considered to be the most endangered ecosystem in the world. And we need to protect what we have left of them. They're very precious ecosystems. And so we want to protect them from these invasive plant species, because once they take over, it's almost impossible to restore that grassland back to what it was. One of the other ones that is not a plant at all, but that I'll bring up because I think it's so fascinating, are the wild boar. So I don't know if people are aware, but that, well, yes, in central Alberta, I'm sure you are aware. They're really, really problematic. And these feral pigs that escaped from domestic farms, they breed like crazy, and they can tear up entire crop fields in like a day. So they're really destructive, they're really damaging. They pose a very serious threat to our pork industry because there's potential if disease spread through the wild boar, it could spread to domestic livestock as well. So these things are spreading, and they are incredibly problematic. So we're working on some education and outreach campaigns with regard to wild boar and what people can do if they find wild boar in their area. So lots of different species, and lots of them are scary for different reasons.
Well, I think it's apt to bring up the wild boar, because especially people living in the country, their vegetable garden can be decimated in minutes almost with a wild boar.
Absolutely.
So it's all hand in hand, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Okay, now what are some of the best practices that people in their everyday life should be doing to prevent the spread of these so they're not introduced to other areas?
Yeah, so one of the big things I think is cleaning your stuff. And that's not the official term that we use, but we have a campaign, it's called Play, Clean, Go. And really it's about when you leave on your journey, clean your boots, clean your dog, clean your mountain bike tires or your quad tires or your horse hooves. Go do what you're going to do. And then before you come back, clean your stuff again. So for example, if you're out on a trailhead, make sure when you leave your house you're clean, and make sure when you're leaving the trailhead that you knock the mud off your boots and that sort of thing. There are so many people in Alberta, and we have so many incredible wild spaces. We have all of this public land. We have our provincial parks, our national parks. So people recreate and people move around a lot and go to these different places. We want to make sure that if we go to a place where there are weeds, that we leave them there and we don't bring them home with us. And that same goes if we have weeds on our property, we don't take them with us and spread them. So I think that that's a really important message for all Albertans, because we do have this beautiful big province that is full of different opportunities for us to recreate, and we all have a role to play in preventing that spread.
And I think along that line too is homeowners be careful with rental equipment. If they're renting a rototiller, a dethatcher, an aerator, any of those, is that before you put it on your property, make sure you've hosed it down really well, because you can spread an awful lot of that, both weeds and fungi and everything. So cleanliness, very important.
Yeah.
I think we already got the info. Can I have you just repeat once again the website, because I think that if people know where to go for information, so can you read it out very carefully, the address for the website?
You bet. So it's www.abinvasives, and that's with an S on the end, .ca. So www.abinvasives.ca.
Good. Okay. And that particular map that you mentioned, the EDD?
Yeah, EDD.
Because I think everyone wants to have that on their phone.
They definitely should. Yeah. So EdMaps Alberta, spelled EDD Maps Alberta. And so you can download that right on your phone. Again, it's super handy. There's so much information packed into that app. Even if you look at this particular species, you pull it up, you can look at a distribution map if you're connected to Wi-Fi. So you can see if it's in the area, those sorts of things. It's an incredibly powerful tool.
Okay, I want to check with anyone who's tuned into this if there was any questions that they want to ask Megan. Maybe Patrick has to let us know whether there is any questions.
I haven't seen any in the chat or anything like that, but if any of you do have them, please feel free to pop them in there. Oh, there we go. Is there a way to get a plant added to the noxious weed list?
So that's really tricky. I think, so there's the Alberta Weed Control Act, and then there's the Weed Control Regulation. So the regulation is a separate piece of legislation, and that's where the species are listed. And the point is, the reason why it was separated like that was so that it would be easier to make modifications to the plant list. In 2012 or 2013, there was proposed changes, substantial proposed changes to be made and it was never passed. So at that time, there was the Alberta Weed Regulatory Advisory Committee, the AWRAC committee, and it was made up of a number of different stakeholders, government people, municipal folks, folks from around the province, and that was a committee that made the recommendations to change, to make modifications to the noxious weed list. They have since disbanded. So my understanding is that that group is no longer functioning, the committee. Although I did hear that maybe they were thinking of starting back up again. But essentially, it's really, really, really tough to make a change to that noxious weed list at this point. What is much easier to do and much more feasible is to contact your local municipal agricultural fieldmen, because those are the people that are given authority under the Weed Control Act, and they have the ability, it has to go through their council, but they can locally elevate a species. So say if you're in a particular county and you have a problem with absinthe wormwood is a really good example. So that's a species that has been locally elevated, I think in Settler County. So it was becoming problematic. They didn't want it, so they elevated it to noxious. So any county has the ability to do that. It's still a process. You're still dealing with some red tape and those sorts of things. But if you really are concerned about a species, I would recommend getting in touch with your local ag fieldman and advocating to get a species locally elevated. The goat's beard, yeah, that one is prolific. It's a lot like, spreads like dandelion, right? Like the seeds look. Sorry, I'm reading the comments. I shouldn't be, but the Sheila mentioned that common Sal's fly. I'm not even sure how to say that, but goat's beard, which is Tragopogon dubius, I believe, is becoming a huge problem in the Edmonton area. I would say throughout Alberta, and we're finding this one. This one is a problem in natural areas. It's a problem in our forested areas. It's a problem in urban areas as well. So this one is all across the board. It seems to do well pretty much everywhere. And yeah, I'm not sure. This one may have been listed before, and it may have been taken off the list, though. I'm not entirely sure. But definitely get in touch with your local, either your ag fieldman, or if you're in the city of Edmonton, get in touch with the IPM, the Integrated Pest Management Program there, and they should be able to give you some information.
I was curious what plant she was going to be referring to. Now, if I say the word dandelion, can you give me some feedback on that?
Oh, so dandelion, my understanding is that dandelion used to be on the list, and they were taken off because they just became so widespread. They were just literally everywhere. And so, we basically, with dandelion, we've lost the battle. And that's why at this point we do more harm in trying to control it than it's just not effective in trying to control it anymore. Yeah, I'm not a fan of dandelions. I try to deal with them on my property, and I'm a bee fan, but I still do not keep my dandelions. I make sure there's other food for my bees. There's lots of other great plants. There's native plants that we can use that are flowering. We do, so try and get rid of those dandelions. Yeah, dandelions.
Everyone has an emotional reaction to dandelions. I see on the questions there, shout out to a friend of mine, Anton Schlaus from Slovenia. And he has asked a question there about one particular plant, an Artemisia, I think it was. I didn't write it down. That's a problem there, and he's wondering if Alberta has it as a problem.
I'm not familiar with this species. Can you tell me the common name, Anton? Or Berta, do you know the common name for this? Is Ambrosia artemisifolia? Artemisifolia?
Yeah, it must be some kind of Artemisia or something.
Yeah,
no, I'm not familiar with it.
I'm not familiar with it either. So that would lead me to suggest that we don't have a problem with it, but I don't know that for sure. But this, yeah, I'm not familiar.
I find it interesting that I've had the pleasure of judging many countries in the world, and thank goodness that some of these plants that are a problem in other countries have not yet spread to Canada, because I think everybody has their problems with invasive and noxious weeds.
Absolutely.
So, anyway, thanks for the question, Anton, and hello to you, and I hope you're surviving COVID just fine there. Is there any other questions? I'm hearing some voices there, but I'm not.
I think
Not
it's my
picking any-
cat. My cat is on the other side of the door meowing like crazy.
Oh, it's your cat. Okay. Okay.
Sorry. She's very noisy.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I thank everyone for participating in this. It has been recorded so that if you wish to share it with anyone else, I think on this we will be sharing it with the National Communities in Bloom so that people from across the country can also learn a little bit about invasive weeds. So I'm going to ask you, Megan, just one question. Does every province have a council similar to yours so that, say, somebody in Nova Scotia can access that information for their particular province and problems?
Yeah, I think that they do. Everyone except for maybe Newfoundland and Labrador. I do sit on a cross Canada the chapter. So there's the Canadian Council for Invasive Species, and yeah, I think almost all of them do. They are. There's a lot of variability in the structure and the capacity within each council. The Invasive Species Council of BC is incredibly robust, and they're well funded. They actually do the on the ground control work. So there's lots of different models as well. Our focus, we're quite a bit smaller. We do a lot of education and outreach. We really try to be the go-to for information. But yeah, there is work being done all across Canada. I would say for sure.
And that's good to hear. Yeah. I'm going to pass on one way of dealing with it that I found very unique. It was in St. Ives in England. And they had what they called the green prescription. So doctors were involved because they learned that the most problems that they saw were either depression or heart disease. And what's the best thing for that? Engaging with other people and physical exercise. And they would choose often a project where there were invasive plants and people would just, a doctor would always be there, but say Wednesday afternoon, they'd be 2 hours or something in an area, just plain digging out invasive plants. So that may be something to think of if you have a small community that just is going to take some sweat and hard work, that maybe get the whole community involved and make it a healing project instead of just a nuisance project. I thought that was very innovative.
Wow.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, Patrick, I think we go back to you and close at this time if we don't have any more comments or questions. Did we lose Patrick? There he is.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for participating today. There are a couple more Communities in Bloom Alberta webinars that we're going to be running over the next couple months, so keep your eyes out for those. And thank you very much, Megan and Berta.
Okay, and I hope everyone enjoys blooming where they are planted this year. Thank you, Megan.